From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
So the Sunday Times broke this story in 1999, and, we're talking about a really horrific case, poisoning of children, and you would have thought that was a very evocative subject. You would have thought it would get a lot of attention, and it didn't.
Back in the 90s, in the town of Corby in Northamptonshire, a scandal was unfolding.
This is the biggest case of poisoning of children in the UK since thalidomide.
An alarming number of children born in the area were being born with physical defects. Nobody knew why. Was it something in the water or something in the air? The authorities didn't seem to want to investigate, and apart from some brave journalism from the Sunday Times, the world seemed to look away.
The journalist who covered it at the time for the Sunday Times, Stephen Bevan, he said, it's not London, it's not Birmingham, so perhaps it didn't get the attention it would have done if it was in one of those bigger cities.
I think it is just because of the era that it happened in, really, that it was just a different kind of world, really.
Local newspapers and the local news channels and all that, whereas nowadays, you'd got something like this, it would have been straight on.
It'd have come up on your phone, wouldn't it?
But there are people in this country whose whole lives have been affected by this story and the long shadow it still casts.
All the deformities that the children have are there for life. They haven't gone. They might have had operations to help improve them, but, it is a lifelong thing that they are left with.
Now, finally, more than 2 decades later, their story is about to be heard.
26 years later, it's going to be on Netflix, so it suddenly is going to get an awful lot of attention all these years on.
The story today, Toxic Town, the mothers seeking justice for their poisoned babies.
I'm Rosamund, the media editor of the Sunday Times.
Ros, tell me about Maggie Marn. Who is she and what happened to her in 1997?
Maggie Marn is 53. She grew up in Corby and she now works as a teaching assistant. She works with 6- and 7-year-old children at a primary school near Kettering and near Corby.
I've lived in Corby all my life, really, and my mum and dad were both born here. Obviously, my grandparents are from Scotland, as most people in Corby are. I got married when I was 22 to Derek, and we've been married 31 years now.
And she's got 2 children, Hannah and Sam. And Sam, her younger child, was born with a club foot.
And when her son Sam was born with a club foot, what did the doctor say?
Well, at first she sort of feels now that they downplayed it rather by suggesting that, he may just have been lying rather weirdly in the womb.
They were like, it'll probably straighten. It might be the way he's been lying in the womb and everything. So, just kind of like, his foot was really bad. It was, really turned him.
But obviously, quickly, she could see that there was something quite seriously wrong there. And that it probably wasn't very likely to straighten out as they might suggest. It has caused a lot of, long-lasting problems for Sam. And when he was a baby, he had to wear these sort of boots day and night and have his feet set in position.
I think when he got to about 6 months, he got put in little white boots day and night, and he had to have a bar, so his feet were kind of set in position like that day and night. So he had to sleep like that as well.
Which you can imagine, it must have been so difficult. And he was one of the children, and I very much relate to this, he's one of those children who didn't like sleeping in his own cot. I have the same problem with my children, and so he slept in his bed with his parents, and he would sort of slam his foot down, which was being held with this big metal bar, so I can't imagine how painful that must have been as a parent.
It must have been so hard to have a baby who has to wear boots all the time, who has a metal rod as a splint. How does Maggie feel talking about it now?
Well, it's still a very emotional thing to talk about.
And then he had to just have it during the day as well. And that's horrible. See, when you live through things, it's different, isn't it? And sometimes thinking, like, reliving it is harder.
You know, as a mother, it is hard not to blame yourself.
You know, you ask questions and it's just like, oh, yeah, I don't know why this happens, sort of thing. You know, obviously, you start asking questions about yourself. Have I done something wrong?
Every parent is a classic parent thing, isn't it? That you worry that you've done something wrong. And of course they hadn't. But she was also a very positive person. And, you know, she had the attitude of worse things happen to other people.
I didn't overly dwell on it because, you know, I know people have worse things and, you know, so it is, well, right, OK, this is my child, I've just got to get on with it.
And they certainly didn't want Sam to feel that there were lots of things he couldn't do and that he couldn't have a good and full and happy life.
Talk us through that physically. How does it still affect him? And how has it continued to affect him?
He really loved football as a boy, but he had to stop playing because it was too painful.
He'd come home and he'd be in agony and that because his leg is half the width because he's got like muscle wastage.
Your muscles can waste, she talked about that. And actually his feet are 2 different sizes, which I hadn't realised would have been an issue. So you have to buy 2 pairs of shoes. I mean, it's a small thing, but of course, shoes are expensive.
Yeah.
So it must be very frustrating. Look, he's doing brilliantly because he's qualifying to be a chartered accountant.
So he works at the local doctors in the accounts department and he's part qualified as a chartered accountant now.
Amazing.
He actually done an exam on Monday and I think he's just got one more to do.
So look, he's somebody who's obviously doing well in life and he has clearly 2 loving parents and a loving family, but it isn't what you'd have chosen necessarily for your child, is it?
Ros, where does this story take place? You said Maggie was born and brought up in Corby. Tell us a bit about Corby.
Corby's a small town. I hadn't actually visited even close to it before I did the story, I should say. It's fewer than 70,000 people live there. It's in the East Midlands, not too far, although not actually that close, to Leicester, Cambridge and Peterborough. So that's where we're talking about in the world. It was an industrial town. It had a steelworks that were closed in 1979, and that's where sort of this story starts. And Maggie talked about when she was growing up.
I remember as a kid, my mum used to have all the nappies on the line, and she'd be like, oh, well, she'd go out, run out, get them in, because it was all black smoke landing all over the white nappies and that. So we kind of lived through pollution during the steelworks, you know, that people got used to, and then it was almost like just another form of it, really.
When it was being closed and redeveloped, the land that the steelworks had been on, it was supposed to be this moment of great hope for Corby.
Yeah.
You know, this was a post-industrial future. And when the steelworks had closed, you know, you'd had rocketing unemployment. It had seemed, I'm sure to many people, that it was a very difficult place to live because lots of people out of work and perhaps a feeling of decline. But as that was happening, it was sort of this red dust that sort of swept across Corby, particularly the areas close to where the land was being redeveloped. And it's because the sort of open trucks carrying away what was actually toxic waste.
Well, tell me about that. Just how bad was the dust that was appearing as a result of this process of supposedly cleaning up Corby?
Yeah, it's fascinating because the reason we're talking about this is there's a Netflix drama, and when you watch it in the Netflix drama, it's this big red dust. You think, oh, they've done that for dramatic effect. And actually, and obviously I asked the women for my piece who were aware of this at the time, and they said, oh no, it was much worse than they showed on the screen.
When I used to travel into work, you would get dust and see it on roads and that, but it's when you actually got in closer to where they were doing it all, which was right next door to where I work, you realised just how bad it was.
Another woman, Tracy Taylor, who worked next to the industrial estate, sort of talked about how she'd have a sort of thick covering. If you put your coffee cup down or a sandwich down, it would be just covered with this red dust.
It was so thick you couldn't have the windows open some days, and you know, you put your tea down and your sandwiches down and come back and there was all dust over them. You'd get clouds come across on hot days like sandstorms.
And you couldn't go outside sometimes because it would sort of burn the back of your throat just being out there in the dust.
It was, honestly, you could not have the windows open. The car had to be washed every time you got home at night.
And they thought at the time that it was sort of mud being kicked up by the lorries moving. And you wouldn't necessarily have thought, so this was, the sort of process happens over 15 years between 1984 and 1999. At the time, people weren't really thinking that, oh, this could be dangerous to me.
Yeah.
And so they just thought, you know, this is just dirt. And actually, Maggie's husband worked driving one of the lorries, and she'd have to sort of beat his clothes to get off the dust from off his trousers and so on.
He'd come home from work, I was pregnant, I'd whack his jeans. I mean, in the programme I'm on, it's on a washing line. But I literally just used to whack them off the wall because they were caked in what I thought was mud, which obviously he thought was just mud. No, he'd have been like that. Oh, Maggie, don't go, you know, there's a load of chemicals on there.
And back then, were there any concerns about whether this process was safe?
Well, the odd person was raising it, certainly. And, you know, it's one of those things. But I don't think most people... And Maggie talked about this to me, that there was sort of a feeling of, oh, we had the pollution from the time, from the steelworks, and now we've got the pollution from fixing it. But, you know, it's sort of normalised. So while you may have had the odd person, you know, tangentially involved in the council saying, hang on a minute, this doesn't seem like this is being done to the standard it should be being done to. You've got to remember as well, this is supposed to be the great hope for the town. You know, this is supposed to be a transformative thing. And so you can imagine it's hard to be the person saying, well, hang on a minute, are we doing this in the way that we should be?
Yeah.
So it's a hard situation and a difficult dynamic to be a whistleblower in that situation. When I've talked to people at the time and you know, journalists who covered it, there's a feeling that the council was very, very powerful in a way perhaps we don't see in quite the same way now. And so to kind of come up against that and say there was something wrong was really difficult. The council's own auditor had said that there was a cavalier approach to the operation of sort of reclaiming the works. And actually, this only came out in court years later, but an internal report prepared by Corby Borough Council, found that residents had been exposed to high levels of zinc, arsenic, boron and nickel as a result of the reclamation works.
Wow. And for the residents, for people like Maggie, at what point did they realise that this dust that they're encountering on a daily basis was, you know, more than an inconvenience? When did they realise this was something that could be really dangerous?
Well, some parents started realising that there appeared to be an abnormally large number of children born mostly with problems with their hands, so missing fingers or in some cases no fingers at all. So there was a sort of growing awareness. And then actually, this is where the Sunday Times came in, because in 1999, the Sunday Times started investigating this and published the first story on it.
And it wasn't until the one morning the Sunday Times come in my door and he said, we think there's some sort of problem going on in Corby with your children born with the deformities. Could we take your story? So I said basically yes, and that was the start of it. From there, and it never stopped.
And that story looked at 4 women who'd all had children with limb deformities. And one of them was Susan McIntyre, who becomes perhaps the most vocal of the campaigners.
Well, I'm Susan. I was born in Scotland. I came to England when I was 3-year-old. So I've been in England for 53 years.
There's a couple of other quite vocal ones too, but she was really a sort of lead campaigner on this and is an absolutely formidable woman. Brilliant. I mean, it was wonderful meeting all of these women. They're incredibly impressive people who've done a very brave thing. But Susan McIntyre, you wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of Susan McIntyre. Her son was born missing the fingers on one of his hands, on his left hand. And
Missing altogether?
Yes, yeah.
When I was born, they just put him over a blanket and someone said, you're going to have a look, he's been born without a hand. So I sort of had to look and went, alright, put it away. Couldn't give me no explanations, tried all the doctors, tried to get explanations why it happened, nothing.
He has repeated surgeries too, and actually at one point the surgeons tried to construct fingers using some of his toes, and she said it didn't really work. I mean, I think the body rejected those, but he's never actually really ended up with that sort of pincer grip that you need to use your hand. You know, that's a very difficult thing to live with, and he certainly has had a very hard time of it. You know, in one article that I found, Susan had said that he'd been so upset and so badly bullied about it that he'd tried to cut off his hand. I mean, that's horrendous.
That is horrendous.
Yeah, it's really, really upsetting. So the mothers start talking to one another. They have this first meeting, and I think 8 mothers turned up to that, and it slowly grows from there. They start to realise this is a problem, but the issue is proving causation. So there's a paediatrician who showed that children born in this area between sort of those dates where they were reclaiming the land, they had 2.5 times the likelihood of having abnormalities with their hands. But actually proving the causation of it is very difficult because obviously children are born in all times with birth defects. So how do you prove those individual cases are caused by this? And I should say the council fought very hard and long against these women. You know, it really is quite astounding. And this case is interesting because most of these cases that we've seen a bit like this are to do with waterborne toxins. So things that have been people have drunk. And this was the first case, and this is why it's a landmark ruling when they do. It's the first case where it's airborne in the whole world. Never before has that causation been done. And that tells you how difficult it was to prove and you know, how much work went into it.
Ros, you described how the dust from a project to effectively clean up the old steelworks site in Corby seemed to be leading to babies being born in the area with defects at a much bigger rate than expected. The mothers start to talk, they realise something is happening, and then the Sunday Times really brings this to light. They start reporting it nationally. Tell me about the reporting. How did that come about?
So I should say that unfortunately one of the 2 journalists whose bylines are on the story is no longer alive. Byline of the story is Stephen Bevan, who was on staff here at the Sunday Times, covering consumer affairs for the paper at the time, and a local reporter called Graham Hind, who seems like one of those classic old school journalists, you know, who had brilliant sources locally. And from what I understand from speaking to Stephen, obviously I should say this is a long time ago and he will have covered hundreds of other stories since then, but he thinks that the original tip came from a paediatrician who was seeing a lot of cases and was thinking, this is strange. You know, there's a lot of children with missing fingers, particularly from around that Corby area. And so that's where it stemmed from. And from there, they looked at why that might have happened, the environmental factors. Speaking to Stephen, they spent some weeks on this, and it's one of those things, because this is the exact way I have to do my job now, that when you're doing a big investigation, you're juggling day-to-day stories at the same time, and then doing this on the side, and this be your concentration. So he would have been in the office and trying to get people to say, yes, this could be the cause, which is the really challenging part. So both journalistically and legally, when, you know, this comes to a legal fight, it's the same challenge, which is trying to say there is a causation here. You know, Stephen does remember it was very legally difficult and that the council pushed back quite hard.
The Sunday Times obviously had a heritage around stories like this. They'd broken the thalidomide scandal. They'd already shown how babies were being born with deformities because of other causes.
The drug thalidomide was supposed to help pregnant women suffering from nausea and sleeplessness. But just one tablet could cause severe malformations in unborn children.
The thalidomide babies, thousands born worldwide, some without limbs, some blind, others deaf. All victims of a drug that was widely prescribed to pregnant women suffering morning sickness in the late 50s and early 60s.
Why was this story even harder to break? Why didn't it get the same sort of national coverage?
It didn't get much traction, and I think we should be honest about that, because as a journalist, sometimes you've done brilliant work. This is one of the frustrations, and you think, why isn't everyone following up the story? I mean, Stephen remembers it as perhaps because it was happening in Corby, and that's a really sad thing. It was seen as very isolated and localised. And so with thalidomide, it cut across class, it cut across geography. It was mothers from all sorts of backgrounds, and here, this little thing happening in Corby, although actually, of course, it turns out that the dust could travel 5 miles, so it's not as though it was completely hyper-localised. And of course, there is the possibility that more people were affected, people who went through Corby. There are possibilities that people may not have realised this was something that has affected them and obviously profoundly affected their child's life.
How did the mothers and the reporting that was starting to happen, how did they manage to prove a link?
Yeah, in the end, the answer is a very good lawyer, I would argue. So there's a man called Des Collins.
Tell us about him.
Yeah, so Des Collins ends up taking this case. Susan talked about why she chose him, and it's a rather sweet story. There were 2 things. The first, on a basic point, was that he knew the area. He'd worked at the Corby Steelworks during a summer when he was a student. And then it was also that, rather sweetly, when he first came to see Susan and her son, Connor, he sort of got down and played with Connor.
But when I met Des, he come round to my house and Connor was playing about with little cars on the floor, and Des sort of tried to join in with him, and Connor's got up on his knee and started drawing his little hand down Des's face, and Des started crying, and he said, this is the sort of thing I want to do.
And I think probably at that point she thought, yeah, he's more invested than other people would be. He doesn't just see this as a case. And, he's done a lot of this sort of work where he's kind of David Goliath fights, I think. I mean, I'm sure there are better legal terms for it than that. But that thing of people who haven't been treated right by a system.
And when some of these mothers found a lawyer, when they found Des Collins, what is it that they were after? What for them would have been justice?
Well, originally they wanted an apology. I mean, that's what they all said to me.
At the start of it, all we ever wanted was hands up, tell us that you've done wrong, apologise.
They wanted somebody to say, understandably, yes, we got this wrong. And I imagine from that they wanted this not to happen to other families.
And when they didn't do that and kept backing down and saying, no, we haven't done anything wrong, that's when the determination of us all got together and, we're going to fight you.
And in the end, because that wasn't forthcoming, they ended up fighting them in this 11-year battle in the end to go to court.
And when Des Collins started to pull this case together, what did they actually find? I mean, how was the dust affecting people? And do we know how many people it was affecting at the time?
It was obviously a major challenge to prove the connection between the dust and these fetal abnormalities. And part of the challenge was that there were children with different birth defects. And in the end, they had to tighten the case only to include children with limb abnormalities. But actually, at the start, they found dozens of children. And the reason they had to tighten that case was that they had to take the strongest case they possibly could. While several heavy metals were found on the sites, which had the potential to be harmful to health, cadmium is the one where at the time a direct link could be made to limb differences in babies. That they had scientific studies that showed that at the time. So that's why they limited the case in that way. And then they had to get experts who were on their side saying that in court, they couldn't say categorically proved it, but that in all likelihood, and I think they got to the 95% chance number from their expert, that is what the likelihood that these two things were linked was. So they could also show statistically, obviously, that there are more children in that area born with limb abnormalities than you would normally expect to see. And then also, they not only had to prove that part of it, but also that there had been negligence on the part of the council. So it isn't enough to say, oh yes, these people polluted. They've got to have sort of had some knowledge that what they were doing was wrong for it to have passed that bar, which eventually the High Court decided they did have that knowledge. Proving that was reliant on leaked information. There are documents that were leaked that show the council had an awareness of what was going on, and also that the auditor of the council had said that the approach taken by the council in terms of the reclamation had been sort of slapdash in its attitude towards health and safety.
And Ros, how many of the families who were affected got some kind of compensation or even an apology?
So in the end, 18 families took a claim against the council. 2 of those ended up being excluded because the council said that the exposure wouldn't have happened at the right time.
Parents, sons and daughters bound together in a decade-long fight for justice. In every one of these families there is a child with a deformity and a mother who claims that toxic chemicals brought the impairment about, and for most the judgment marked a victory.
The landmark judgment in the High Court was made in 2009, and we don't know how much people got because these were sort of out-of-court settlements and their sums weren't disclosed. But in 2010, the settlements were reached, and they actually paid out not just on those 16 cases, but on a further 3 cases. So those 2 that had been discounted, they paid out on, and a further case. So in the end, 19 families got compensation.
Did they ever get an apology?
So for 10 years, the council fought back and sort of refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing here.
Mistakes were made, we accept that. What we find difficult to accept is that those mistakes led to these birth defects, and that's what we really need to find to our satisfaction. At that point, we will apologise and we will look to compensate these families.
And actually, there's a story here from 2004 from The Times, where the head of legal management of the council is saying, the council has not received any evidence which links the land reclamation programme with congenital upper limb deformities. As such, it cannot accept the contaminants which were present are responsible for the deformities. So you can see that's 5 years after the original report. And it takes another 5 years until the High Court ruled in the mother's favour, and that's 10 years after that first Sunday Times article, for the council to say sorry and to acknowledge their side of wrongdoing. And Susan McIntyre, the mother of Connor, said at the time,
"The apologies means more than gold to me. It has done from day one and it will do. I will frame the apology. We didn't need the money. We don't want the money. It was the apology that means more to me than anything."
Some of the mothers did get compensation from the council, but not all. You've spoken to some of them recently. Is there still sort of a sense of injustice there?
Yes, and I think one of the things that they think might happen as a result of this case getting more coverage now as a result of the Netflix drama is they think that more people might come forward.
Because it was only put out in, like, on the local news as opposed to national news.
Yeah.
You know, those that have obviously travelled in for work or out of work or moved away didn't know about it and probably wouldn't, you know, still to this day don't know about it, which is why I'm hoping that this will reach so many people.
Obviously, they don't know that. You can't guarantee that. But it is possible there are people out there who haven't linked the fact that their child was born with a limb abnormality to the fact that they travelled through Corby or, you know, had some connection to the town. So there is a hope as well, I think, that people might sort of look at the effects of the environment more broadly. I think that's their other hope, that while things have certainly improved as a result of this case, I'm sure, in the handling of toxic waste, we can always do more to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And I think that's the other point that the mothers would like to make. I spoke to Jack Thorne, who's the writer for the Netflix drama, and he said that his feeling about it, and his dad was a town planner, and he said that one of his big feelings is that in this society we always talk about cutting red tape as though it's always a good thing, but actually red tape is often about protecting people. And so, there's sort of bizarre, wrong way round looking at it, that, it's great if businesses don't have to handle red tape, in this case, a council. But actually, of course, if red tape's there to protect people and, the right kind of red tape, then actually it's really important. And perhaps we also need to think more broadly in society about how we talk about these things. So we don't always assume that, these things are just there to make life more difficult. Sometimes they're there to protect people and actually, of course, make people's lives easier. Other people, the people who are actually affected by these things. So I think that might also be an important part of the message of this.
That was Rosamund Urwin, media editor for the Sunday Times. You can read more on the Corby mothers online with a subscription at thetimes.com. Toxic Town will be out on Netflix on the 27th of February. The producer today was Edward Drummond, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you'd like to get in touch with us about this or any other story, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.